The morning sun cast long shadows across the military courthouse as Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison walked through the heavy oak doors. His polished black boots clicked against the marble floor with each measured step. 23 years of military service had taught him to keep his spine straight and his head high, even when the world seemed to be crashing down around him. Morrison's Royal Guard uniform was spotless, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The gold buttons gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his shoulder boards displayed the proud insignia of his rank. But it was the collection of ribbons and medals on his chest that drew every eye in the room. Among them, sitting in the place of honor, was the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration that could be awarded to any soldier. The medal itself was a work of art. The bronze star hung from a light blue ribbon dotted with white stars, representing the flag of the nation he had sworn to protect. Morrison had earned it 3 years ago during what the official records called extraordinary acts of heroism under enemy fire. The memory of that day in Afghanistan still burned in his mind, though now those same memories were being called into question. As Morrison took his place at the defendant's table, he could feel the weight of dozens of stares. The courtroom was packed with fellow soldiers, military officials, and journalists who had come to witness what many were calling the trial of the decade. How could a decorated war hero, a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to serving his country, be accused of such terrible crimes? His defense attorney, Colonel Patricia Davis, sat beside him, shuffling through a stack of papers. Her face looked tired and worried. Morrison had known Davis for years. She was one of the best military lawyers in the service. But even she seemed overwhelmed by the mountain of evidence that the prosecution claimed to have against him. At the prosecution table sat Captain Rebecca Williams, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who had built her career on taking down military fraud cases. She had requested this assignment personally, telling her superiors that she wanted to prove that no one was above the law, regardless of how many medals they wore or how high they had climbed in the ranks. Williams had spent months building her case against Morrison. She had interviewed dozens of witnesses, combed through thousands of pages of military records, and even traveled to Afghanistan to walk the ground where Morrison's alleged heroics had taken place. What she found there, she claimed, painted a very different picture than the one that had earned Morrison his Medal of Honor. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Advocate General Patricia Hayes entered through a side door. Hayes was a legend in military legal circles, a tough, no-nonsense judge who had presided over some of the most important court-martial cases in recent history. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her steel-blue eyes seemed to see right through anyone who dared to lie in her courtroom. "This court is now in session," Hayes announced, her voice carrying easily to the back of the packed room. "We are here today to address serious charges against Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, specifically allegations of fraud, conduct unbecoming an officer, and the wrongful receipt of military honors." Morrison felt his stomach tighten as the judge read the charges. Each word hit him like a physical blow. Fraud, conduct unbecoming, wrongful receipt. These were career-ending accusations that could not only strip him of his medals and rank, but could also land him in military prison for years. "Captain," Williams rose from her seat, her expression grim but determined. "Your Honor, the prosecution will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison has perpetrated one of the most shameful frauds in military history. We will show that on the day in question, rather than performing the heroic acts described in his Medal of Honor citation, Morrison actually abandoned his post and left his fellow soldiers to face enemy fire alone." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Morrison closed his eyes, remembering that terrible day 3 years ago. The heat of the Afghan sun, the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls, the screams of wounded soldiers calling for help. He remembered every detail with crystal clarity. But apparently his version of events was very different from what his accusers claimed had really happened. Williams continued her opening statement, painting a picture of Morrison as a coward who had constructed an elaborate lie to cover up his failures as a leader. The evidence will show that when Morrison's unit came under attack during what should have been a routine patrol, he immediately called for evacuation rather than fighting to protect his men. While his soldiers were pinned down by enemy fire, Morrison was already planning his escape route. Morrison's jaw clenched as he listened to the accusations. How could anyone who wasn't there that day claim to know what had really happened? The official investigation had been thorough, interviewing every surviving member of his unit. The Medal of Honor recommendation had gone through multiple levels of review, including interviews with eyewitnesses and analysis of radio communications. How could all of that be wrong? Furthermore, Williams said, her voice growing stronger, we will present evidence that Morrison later fabricated detailed accounts of heroic actions that never took place. He claimed to have rescued wounded soldiers under heavy fire, to have personally eliminated multiple enemy positions, and to have shown extraordinary leadership under the most difficult circumstances. Our investigation has revealed that none of these claims can be substantiated by reliable witness testimony or physical evidence. Colonel Davis stood to deliver her opening statement, but Morrison could see the doubt in her eyes. The prosecution's case sounded overwhelming, even to someone who was supposed to be fighting for his innocence. How do you defend against accusations when the very people who were supposed to support you had turned against you? Your Honor, Davis began, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison has served his country with distinction for over 2 decades. His record speaks for itself. Multiple deployments, commendations for bravery and the respect of his peers and subordinates. The prosecution would have you believe that this decorated soldier suddenly decided to throw away everything he had worked for by fabricating a story of heroism. We maintain that the evidence will show Morrison acted with courage and honor, just as he has throughout his entire career. But even as Davis spoke, Morrison could see that her words were falling flat. The prosecution had clearly done their homework, and they seemed confident that they had enough evidence to destroy his reputation and his freedom. Williams called her first witness, Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, a man who had served under Morrison for 2 years before the incident in Afghanistan. Torres walked to the witness stand with obvious reluctance, avoiding eye contact with Morrison as he passed the defense table. Sergeant Torres, Williams began, please tell the court about your relationship with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison prior to the events in question. Torres shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sir, ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was my commanding officer. I had a lot of respect for him. He was always fair, always looked out for his soldiers. That's why what happened over there was so hard to understand. What exactly did you observe on the day in question? Torres took a deep breath before answering. We were on what was supposed to be a standard patrol through the Kandahar Valley. About 3 hours into the mission, we started taking fire from multiple positions. It was intense, probably the heaviest contact we'd seen in months. Morrison remembered Torres well. The young sergeant had been one of his most reliable soldiers, always volunteering for the dangerous assignments and never complaining about the harsh conditions in Afghanistan. Hearing him testify against his former commander was like being stabbed in the back by a trusted friend. What did Lieutenant Colonel Morrison do when the firing started? Williams asked. Torres looked down at his hands. At first, he did what any good officer would do. He got on the radio, tried to coordinate our response, called for air support. But then something changed. He started talking about extraction, about getting us out of there as fast as possible. Did that seem unusual to you? Yes, ma'am. In the past, when we'd been in similar situations, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison always emphasized completing the mission. He used to say that we don't quit until the job is done. But that day, he seemed more focused on getting us out than on fighting back. Williams nodded, making notes on her legal pad. What happened next? The firing got heavier and we had some casualties. Private Johnson took a round in the leg, and Corporal Williams was hit in the shoulder. They needed immediate medical attention, but we were pinned down pretty good. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Morrison made the call for emergency extraction. Morrison wanted to jump up and explain what had really happened that day, but his attorney had warned him to stay silent during the prosecution's case. There were so many details that Torres was leaving out, so many crucial pieces of information that would completely change how people understood those events. In your opinion, Sergeant Torres, was Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's decision to call for extraction appropriate given the tactical situation? The second day of testimony began with an even larger crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Word had spread about the previous day's shocking revelations, and it seemed like everyone wanted to witness the downfall of a once-respected war hero. Morrison walked through the crowd of reporters and curious onlookers, with the same military bearing he had maintained throughout his career. But inside, he felt like his world was crumbling. Captain Williams wasted no time in calling her next witness. Corporal Danny Rodriguez had been with Morrison's unit for just 6 months before the incident in Afghanistan, but his testimony would prove to be even more damaging than what they had heard the day before. Rodriguez was a small, wiry man in his mid-20s with nervous eyes that darted around the courtroom as he took his place at the witness stand. Unlike Torres, who had seemed reluctant to testify against his former commander, Rodriguez appeared almost eager to tell his story. "Corporal Rodriguez," Williams began, "please describe your role in Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unit during the GU deployment in question." "I was a radio operator, ma'am. Part of my job was to monitor communications between our unit and headquarters, as well as with other units in the area. I heard pretty much everything that was said over the radio during our missions." Williams nodded approvingly. A radio operator would have had access to all the communications that took place during the battle. Exactly the kind of witness she needed to prove her case. "What did you hear Lieutenant Colonel Morrison say over the radio on the day in question?" Rodriguez shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at Morrison before looking away. "Well, ma'am, when the shooting started, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison got on the radio real quick, but he wasn't calling for reinforcements or air support like you'd expect. His first call was to request immediate extraction for the entire unit." Buzz of conversation swept through the courtroom. Morrison felt his face burn with embarrassment and anger. That wasn't how it had happened at all, but he was powerless to interrupt the testimony. "Was that unusual?" Williams asked. "Yes, ma'am. Very unusual. In most firefights, the first priority is to establish contact with the enemy and try to neutralize the threat. Calling for extraction right off the bat? Well, it made it seem like Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's main concern was getting out of there as fast as possible." Williams walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. "I'm showing you what has been marked as Prosecution Exhibit C, radio transcripts from the day in question. Do these transcripts accurately reflect what you heard over the radio?" Rodriguez examined the papers for several minutes before nodding. "Yes, ma'am. These look accurate to what I remember hearing. Please read to the court what Lieutenant Colonel Morrison said at 14:23 hours. Rodriguez cleared his throat and began reading, from the transcript in a halting voice. "Bravo 6 to base, we have enemy contact from multiple positions. Request immediate dust-off for entire unit. Repeat, requesting emergency extraction. We cannot hold this position." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Morrison wanted to scream that the transcript was being taken completely out of context, that there were critical details missing that would explain everything. But Colonel Davis had made it clear that any outburst from him would only make things worse. Williams continued her examination, having Rodriguez read several more radio transmissions that painted Morrison as increasingly desperate to abandon the mission and get his unit to safety. According to the transcripts, Morrison had called for extraction no fewer than 7 times during the 30-minute engagement. Corporal Rodriguez, in your experience, was it normal for a commanding officer to be so focused on extraction rather than completing the mission? No, ma'am. Most officers I've served under would try everything possible to complete the objective before considering withdrawal. They'd call for air support, reinforcements, artillery, whatever it took to get the job done. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison seemed more interested in running than fighting. The damage was mounting with each word. Morrison could see the doubt in the faces of the spectators, the way they looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. Here he was, a decorated soldier who had spent his entire adult life serving his country, being portrayed as a coward who cared more about his own safety than the lives of his men. But the worst was yet to come. Williams called her next witness, Major Thomas Bradford, Morrison's second-in-command during the Afghan deployment. Bradford had been with the unit for over 2 years and was widely respected among the enlisted soldiers. His testimony would carry enormous weight with the court. Bradford walked to the witness stand with the confident stride of a career military officer. He was tall and lean, with graying hair at his temples and the bearing of someone who had seen combat many times. Unlike the previous witnesses, Bradford looked directly at Morrison as he passed, his expression unreadable. "Major Bradford," Williams began, "you served as Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's executive officer during the deployment in question. How would you characterize your working relationship?" "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was my commanding officer, and I respected that chain of command," Bradford replied in a measured tone. "We worked together effectively on most matters related to unit operations and personnel management. Did you have any concerns about Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's leadership during the deployment?" Bradford paused, seemingly reluctant to answer. "Initially, no. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had a solid reputation, and his previous performance evaluations were excellent. However, as the deployment progressed, I began to notice some troubling patterns." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. Bradford had been his most trusted subordinate, the man he had relied on to help lead their unit through one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan. If Bradford was testifying against him, the situation was even worse than he had imagined. "What kind of patterns?" Williams prompted. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison seemed increasingly reluctant to engage in high-risk operations. On several occasions, he modified or canceled missions that I considered well within our unit's capabilities. He appeared to be prioritizing force protection over mission accomplishment. The military audience understood exactly what Bradford was implying. In military doctrine, there was always a balance between protecting your soldiers and accomplishing the mission. An officer who consistently chose safety over objectives was considered weak and ineffective. "Can you give the court a specific example?" Bradford nodded. "About 2 weeks before the incident in question, we were tasked with conducting a reconnaissance mission in a village suspected of harboring insurgent forces. The mission planning was solid. We had adequate intelligence, and the risk level was manageable. But Lieutenant Colonel Morrison canceled the operation at the last minute, citing what I considered to be minimal security concerns." Williams made notes as Bradford spoke. "Did this pattern continue?" "Yes, ma'am. Over the final month of our deployment, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison canceled or significantly modified at least 4 operations that I believed were necessary and achievable. It created tension within the unit as the soldiers began to question whether their commander had the courage to lead them into combat. Morrison wanted to explain that each of those canceled missions had been based on intelligence that Bradford wasn't privy to, that there were classified reasons for his decisions that went far beyond simple risk assessment. But revealing those details would require disclosing information that could compromise ongoing operations and put other soldiers at risk. Now, regarding the specific incident that led to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's Medal of Honor recommendation, were you present during the firefight?" "Yes, ma'am. I was with the unit throughout the entire engagement." "In your opinion, did Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's actions during that firefight merit the award of the Medal of Honor?" Bradford was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. Finally, Bradford shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. Based on what I observed that day, I do not believe Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's actions rose to the level of extraordinary heroism required for the Medal of Honor." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Morrison felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Having his own executive officer publicly state that he didn't deserve his highest military honor was devastating beyond words. Williams pressed on. "Can you explain what you observed during the firefight?" "When we came under fire, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's immediate response was to call for extraction, rather than trying to fight through the enemy positions. While that's not necessarily wrong tactically, it didn't demonstrate the kind of aggressive leadership and personal courage that you'd expect from a Medal of Honor recipient. Did you witness Lieutenant Colonel Morrison personally engaging enemy forces?" Bradford hesitated. "I saw Lieutenant Colonel Morrison moving around the battlefield, but I did not personally observe him engaging specific enemy targets or performing the heroic actions described in his citation." "What about the rescue of wounded soldiers that was mentioned in the Medal of Honor citation?" "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison did help move wounded soldiers to the extraction point, but so did many other members of the unit. His actions were professional and appropriate." The third day of the trial brought with it a sense of inevitability that hung over the courtroom like a dark cloud. Morrison had barely slept the night before, his mind racing through the events that had led him to this moment. The testimony from his own soldiers had been devastating, and he knew that today would likely seal his fate. Captain Williams had promised the court that she would present physical evidence and expert analysis that would remove any remaining doubt about Morrison's guilt. As Morrison took his seat at the defense table, he noticed that the crowd of spectators had grown even larger. Word of the shocking testimony had spread beyond the military community, and now the trial was attracting national attention. Williams called her first witness of the day, Dr. Michael Chen, a forensic expert who specialized in analyzing military records and communications. Dr. Chen was a civilian contractor who had worked with the military for over 15 years, helping to investigate everything from friendly fire incidents to suspected war crimes. Dr. Chen took the witness stand carrying a laptop computer and a thick folder of documents. His appearance was unremarkable, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, but his credentials were impressive. He held advanced degrees in computer science and military history, and had testified as an expert witness in dozens of high-profile cases. Dr. Chen, Williams began, have you had the opportunity to examine the radio communications and digital records from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unit on the day in question? Yes, I have. I've spent considerable time analyzing the digital communications logs, the GPS tracking data, and the after-action reports filed by various members of the unit. Williams nodded and moved to the evidence table. What conclusions did you reach based on your analysis? Dr. Chen opened his laptop and projected a detailed timeline onto a screen visible to the entire courtroom. Based on the digital evidence, I can reconstruct with considerable accuracy what happened during the firefight. The data shows a clear pattern of behavior that supports the testimony we've heard from the previous witnesses. Morrison leaned forward, studying the timeline that Dr. Chen had created. It showed radio transmissions, GPS positions, and weapon firing data from his unit's engagement with enemy forces. At first glance, it looked impressive and scientific, but Morrison could see that crucial details were missing or misinterpreted. For example, Dr. Chen continued, the GPS data shows that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's position remained relatively static throughout most of the engagement. Unlike other members of his unit who can be seen moving tactically to engage enemy positions, Morrison stayed near the landing zone where the evacuation helicopters would arrive. Williams walked closer to the screen, pointing to specific data points. What does this suggest about Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's actions during the firefight? It suggests that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was primarily focused on coordinating the evacuation rather than actively engaging the enemy. This is consistent with the witness testimony that described him as being more concerned with getting out of the combat zone than with fighting. Morrison wanted to explain that his position near the landing zone had been strategically chosen for reasons that went far beyond simple evacuation planning, but those reasons were still classified at the highest levels of government. He watched, helplessly, as Dr. Chen continued to misinterpret data that told only part of the story. Did you find any evidence to support the heroic actions described in Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's Medal of Honor citation? Dr. Chen shook his head. The digital evidence does not support claims that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison single-handedly eliminated multiple enemy positions or rescued wounded soldiers under heavy fire. The weapon firing data from his personal equipment shows minimal engagement with enemy forces, and the GPS tracking indicates that his movements were limited and focused on defensive rather than offensive actions. The expert testimony continued for over an hour, with Dr. Chen systematically dismantling every element of Morrison's Medal of Honor citation using computer data and scientific analysis. To the casual observer, it seemed like an open and shut case. How could Morrison argue with GPS coordinates and digital timestamps? But Morrison knew that the most sophisticated computer analysis in the world couldn't capture the full complexity of what had happened that day in Afghanistan. There were aspects of the mission that weren't reflected in any digital record, classified elements that even Dr. Chen wasn't cleared to know about. Williams called her final witness of the day, General Robert Hutchinson, Morrison's commanding Officer during the Afghan deployment. Hutchinson was a legend in the military, a three-star general who had commanded combat operations in multiple theaters and was widely respected throughout the armed forces. The courtroom fell silent as General A. Hutchinson entered. Even in this setting, his presence commanded respect. He was a tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his entire life in service to his country. Morrison had always looked up to Hutchinson as a mentor and father figure, which made what was about to happen even more painful. "General Hutchinson," Williams began, "you were Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's commanding officer during the deployment in question. How would you characterize his performance?" Prior to the incident that led to his Medal of Honor recommendation, Hutchinson's voice was steady but heavy with disappointment. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was a competent officer with a solid record. I had no significant concerns about his leadership or tactical abilities prior to that deployment. Did you personally review and approve Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's Medal of Honor recommendation? Yes, I did. The recommendation came to me with supporting documentation and witness statements that painted a picture of extraordinary heroism under fire. Based on that information, I endorsed the recommendation and forwarded it up the chain of command. Williams paused, letting the weight of the general's words sink in. Having now reviewed the evidence presented in this court-martial, do you still support that recommendation? General Hutchinson was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison could see the internal struggle playing out on his mentor's face. When he finally spoke, his words cut like a knife. Based on the testimony and evidence presented here, I have serious doubts about whether Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's actions on that day warranted the Medal of Honor. It appears that the initial reports may have been incomplete or inaccurate. Morrison felt his heart sink. Having his commanding officer publicly question his Medal of Honor was perhaps the most devastating blow yet. This was the man who had written his performance evaluations, who had trusted him with increasingly important responsibilities, who had recommended him for promotion. To hear General Hutchinson express doubt about his integrity was almost unbearable. General, if you had known then what you know now, would you have endorsed Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's Medal of Honor recommendation? Hutchinson looked directly at Morrison for the first time since taking the stand. I cannot in good conscience say that I would have. The Medal of Honor is our nation's highest military decoration, reserved for acts of extraordinary heroism that go far beyond the call of duty. Based on what I've learned during this trial, I do not believe Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's actions met that standard. Williams nodded solemnly. In your professional opinion, what should happen to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's Medal of Honor? If the allegations presented in this court are proven to be true, then Lieutenant Colonel Morrison should not continue to wear that decoration. The Medal of Honor represents the highest ideals of military service, and it cannot be allowed to be tarnished by false claims of heroism. Colonel Davis attempted to cross-examine General Hutchinson, but the damage was already done. The general acknowledged that Morrison had been a good officer with an otherwise exemplary record, but he stood by his assessment that the Medal of Honor had been awarded based on incomplete information. As the testimony concluded for the day, Judge Hayes announced that she was ready to hear closing arguments. The weight of evidence against Morrison seemed overwhelming. Witness testimony from his own soldiers, expert analysis of digital records, and the devastating testimony of his commanding officer all pointed to the same conclusion. Williams rose to deliver her closing argument, her voice filled with conviction. Your Honor, the evidence in this case is clear and compelling. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison has perpetrated a fraud against the United States military and the American people. He has dishonored the Medal of Honor and betrayed the trust placed in him by his soldiers and his superiors. Williams walked to where Morrison sat, her eyes fixed on the Medal of Honor pinned to his uniform. That decoration represents the highest ideals of military service: courage, honor, and selfless sacrifice. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison has shown none of these qualities. Instead, he has demonstrated cowardice in the face of the enemy and dishonesty in reporting his actions. Morrison watched as Williams painted him as everything he had spent his career fighting against: a selfish officer who put his own safety above the welfare of his soldiers and the success of the mission. According to me, you are Her narrative. He was a man who had fabricated a story of heroism to advance his own career and reputation. The 30-minute recess felt like an eternity to Morrison. He sat in the small conference room adjacent to the courtroom with Colonel Davis, both of them trying to process what had just happened. The sudden appearance of the intelligence analyst had caught everyone off guard, including the prosecution team who were huddled in intense discussion down the hall. "Do you have any idea who this David Chen is?" Davis asked, shuffling through her papers nervously. Morrison shook his head. "I've never heard of him before, but if he's carrying classified information about our mission in Afghanistan, it means there were aspects of that deployment that I wasn't told about." Davis looked confused. "What do you mean? You were the commanding officer. Wouldn't you know about any classified operations involving your own unit?" "Not necessarily," Morrison replied, his mind racing through the possibilities. "There are levels of classification that go beyond what unit commanders typically have access to. If there was some kind of special operations or intelligence mission happening parallel to our standard patrol duties, I might not have been fully briefed." The more Morrison thought about it, the more certain he became that Chen's arrival was connected to the strange inconsistencies he had noticed during his time in Afghanistan. There had been several occasions when he had received last-minute changes to mission orders, times when his superiors had insisted on specific routes or timing that didn't make tactical sense. At the time, he had assumed it was just the usual military bureaucracy, but now he wondered if there had been a hidden agenda. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. David Chen sat at a small table that had been set up near the witness stand, his briefcase open and several classified documents spread out before him. Judge Hayes had clearly been briefed on whatever Chen had shown her during the recess because her entire demeanor had changed. The stern, no-nonsense judge now looked deeply troubled. "Mr. Chen," Judge Hayes began, "please state your credentials for the record." Chen stood and addressed the court in a clear, confident voice. "Your Honor, my name is David Chen. I am a senior intelligence analyst with the Department of Defense holding a top-secret security clearance with access to special compartmented information. I have been authorized by the Secretary of Defense to present classified evidence relevant to this court-martial." Morrison noticed that Captain Williams looked uncomfortable for the first time since the trial began. Whatever Chen was about to reveal, it was clearly something that the prosecution hadn't expected. "Mr. Chen, you indicated that you have information relevant to the charges against Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. Please explain." Chen picked up one of the documents from his table. "Your Honor, the mission that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unit was conducting on the day in question was not a routine patrol as described in the unclassified records. It was actually a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation designed to identify and capture a suspected double agent who had been providing information to enemy forces." A gasp went through the courtroom. Morrison felt his heart racing as Chen continued to speak. This was the first time he was hearing about any intelligence operation connected to his unit's mission. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was not fully briefed on the intelligence aspects of the mission for operational security reasons. His unit was being used as cover for a more complex operation that involved multiple agencies and special operations personnel. Judge Hayes leaned forward. "Are you saying that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was unaware that his unit was participating in an intelligence operation?" "That's correct, Your Honor. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison believed he was conducting a standard patrol mission. However, his actions during the subsequent firefight were actually crucial to the success of the intelligence operation, even though he didn't realize it at the time." Morrison's mind was reeling. Everything he thought he knew about that day in Afghanistan was apparently wrong. The mission briefing he had received, the objectives he had been given, even the route his unit had taken, all of it had apparently been part of some larger operation that he had never been told about. Chen continued his testimony, explaining that Morrison's unit had been deliberately sent into an area where they were likely to encounter enemy forces. The goal was to create a situation that would force the suspected double agent to reveal himself by reacting to the intelligence that only he would have access to. The radio communications that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison sent during the firefight were not just standard tactical reports, Chen explained. They contained coded information that was being monitored by intelligence personnel. Morrison's calls for extraction were actually confirming that the intelligence operation was proceeding as planned. Williams jumped to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. If Lieutenant Colonel Morrison wasn't aware of any intelligence operation, how could his communications have contained coded information?" Chen looked directly at Williams. "Because Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was following communication protocols that had been specifically designed to serve dual purposes. He thought he was following standard operating procedures. But the language, he was required to use contained embedded intelligence markers." Morrison remembered the pre-deployment briefings where they had been given updated communication protocols. At the time, the changes had seemed minor. Slightly different phrasing for certain types of reports, new code words for various tactical situations. He had assumed it was just the military's tendency to constantly revise procedures. But now, he realized that those protocols had been designed to serve the intelligence operation. "Mr. Chen," Judge Hayes asked, "what evidence do you have to support these claims?" Chen opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. "Your Honor, I have recordings of the actual radio communications from that day, including the intelligence channels that were monitoring Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unit. I also have documentation of the intelligence operation, including mission parameters and post-operation analysis." As Chen began playing the recordings, Morrison heard his own voice from 3 years ago, calling for extraction and reporting on the tactical situation. But now, listening with the knowledge of what had really been happening, he could hear how his words had carried double meanings. The phrase "unable to hold position" that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison used was actually a code indicating that the intelligence operation should proceed to the next phase, Chen explained. His repeated requests for extraction were confirming that he had identified suspicious behavior from someone within his own unit. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. He had identified suspicious behavior during the firefight, specifically from Major Bradford, his second-in-command. Bradford had been making radio calls that seemed unnecessary, asking for information about the unit's position and status that he should have already known. At the time, Morrison had attributed it to stress and the chaos of combat, but now he wondered if Bradford had been trying to relay information to enemy forces. Chen continued to present evidence that painted a completely different picture of what had happened that day. Rather than being a coward who had tried to abandon his mission, Morrison had unknowingly played a crucial role in exposing a security breach that had been compromising military operations for months. The intelligence operation was successful, Chen testified. The suspected double agent was identified and subsequently arrested. His activities had resulted in multiple successful enemy ambushes and the deaths of several coalition personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's actions, while he was unaware of their true purpose, were instrumental in protecting future operations and saving lives. Williams tried to object to Chen's testimony on grounds that it was based on classified information that couldn't be verified by the defense, but Judge Hayes overruled her. The federal court order that Chen had presented gave him broad authority to declassify information relevant to Morrison's case. "Mr. Chen, you mentioned that a double agent was identified and arrested. Can you tell the court who this person was?" Chen paused for a moment, then looked directly at Major Bradford, who was sitting in the gallery with other witnesses. The double agent was Major Thomas Bradford, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's executive officer. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Bradford jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger and panic. "That's a lie!" he shouted. "I served my country faithfully for 20 years. Military police officers immediately moved to restrain Bradford as he continued to protest his innocence. Morrison watched in shock as his second-in-command, the man who had testified against him just 2 days earlier, was handcuffed and led away from the courtroom. Chen waited for order to be restored before continuing. Major Bradford had been under surveillance for several months before the mission in question. Intelligence agencies had identified patterns in enemy ambushes that suggested someone with access to operational planning was providing information to insurgent forces. The mission that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unit conducted was designed to confirm Bradford's identity as the source of those leaks. Morrison's mind was racing as he tried to process this information. Bradford had been the one who had encouraged him to cancel several missions in the weeks leading up to the firefight. The courtroom buzzed with electric tension as everyone tried to process the shocking revelations from David Chen's testimony. Morrison sat at the defense table, his mind still reeling from the discovery that his most trusted subordinate had been a traitor all along. The man he had relied on for tactical advice, operational planning, and leadership support had been systematically betraying their unit for months. Judge Hayes called the court back to order, her expression grave as she addressed the packed courtroom. Given the extraordinary nature of the evidence that has been presented, this court will hear additional testimony from Mr. Chen before proceeding to final arguments. Chen returned to the witness stand carrying a thick folder of documents and what appeared to be audio recording equipment. Morrison noticed that several federal agents had quietly entered the courtroom during the recess, positioning themselves near the exits. Clearly, the implications of Chen's testimony extended far beyond Morrison's court-martial. Mr. Chen, Judge Hayes began, you testified that Major Bradford was identified as a double agent. Can you provide the court with more details about his activities and how they were discovered? Chen opened his folder and consulted several documents. Your Honor, Major Bradford first came to the attention of intelligence agencies approximately 8 months before the incident in question. Coalition forces had experienced a series of successful enemy ambushes that suggested someone with access to operational planning was providing information to insurgent forces. Morrison remembered those ambushes. They had been devastating, resulting in multiple casualties and the loss of significant equipment. At the time, his unit had attributed them to improved enemy intelligence gathering, but now he realized that Bradford had been directly responsible for the deaths of soldiers under their command. The pattern of attacks was very specific, Chen continued. Enemy forces seemed to know exact routes, timing, and force strength for operations that were planned at the battalion level or higher. This suggested that the source of the intelligence leaks was someone with access to high-level operational information. Judge Hayes leaned forward. How was Major Bradford identified as the source of these leaks? Through a combination of communications, intercepts, and analysis of operational security patterns. Intelligence agencies began monitoring communications from suspected units and cross-referencing them with subsequent enemy activity. Major Bradford's communications showed suspicious patterns, including unauthorized transmissions and contacts with individuals who were later identified as enemy agents. Morrison felt sick as he thought about all the times Bradford had volunteered to handle communications with higher headquarters, all the occasions when Bradford had asked detailed questions about upcoming operations. He had thought his executive officer was just being thorough and professional, but Bradford had actually been gathering intelligence to sell to the enemy. Chen produced a series of photographs and documents. These are images of Major Bradford meeting with known enemy agents in a village approximately 15 kilometers from your unit's base of operations. The meetings took place on 3 separate occasions over a 6-week period leading up to the EI mission in question. Morrison stared at the photographs in disbelief. There was Bradford, clearly visible in surveillance photos, sitting across from men who were known to be connected to insurgent forces. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Morrison struggled to find words for his emotions. Mr. Chen, how did the mission that led to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's Medal of Honor fit into the investigation of Major Bradford? Chen turned to a new section of his documents. By the time of that mission, intelligence agencies had gathered enough evidence to confirm Bradford's identity as the source of the leaks, but they needed to catch him in the act of transmitting operational information to enemy forces. The mission was designed to create a situation where Bradford would feel compelled to pass along intelligence about the unit's position and activities. Morrison began to understand the true complexity of what had happened that day. His unit hadn't just stumbled into an enemy ambush. They had been deliberately placed in a dangerous situation to force Bradford to reveal himself. Morrison and his soldiers had unknowingly served as bait in a counterintelligence operation. The firefight that ensued was partly genuine enemy action and partly orchestrated by Bradford himself, Chen explained. Bradford had provided enemy forces with detailed information about the unit's route and timing, but he had also given them false information about the unit's strength and equipment to make the ambush appear more spontaneous. Judge Hayes looked troubled. Are you saying that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's soldiers were deliberately put at risk for the purposes of this intelligence operation? Chen nodded reluctantly. Yes, Your Honor, but with extensive precautions in place. Special operations. Personnel were positioned nearby to intervene if the situation became too dangerous, and air support was standing by. The goal was to create a realistic combat scenario while minimizing actual risk to the soldiers involved. Morrison felt a surge of anger at the realization that his soldiers had been used as unknowing participants in a dangerous intelligence game. While he understood the necessity of catching Bradford, the thought that his men had been deliberately placed in harm's way was deeply disturbing. What role did Lieutenant Colonel Morrison play in the success of this operation? Judge Hayes asked. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's actions were crucial to the operation's success in several ways, Chen replied. First, his tactical leadership during the firefight prevented the situation from becoming more dangerous than intended. Second, his communications, while he thought he was following standard procedures, actually provided real-time intelligence about Bradford's activities. And third, his decision-making under pressure helped to expose Bradford's attempts to manipulate the tactical situation. Chen explained how Morrison's repeated calls for extraction had actually been part of a predetermined communication plan designed to force Bradford to reveal his treasonous activities. As Morrison had called for evacuation, Bradford had become increasingly desperate to coordinate with enemy forces, ultimately making transmissions that were intercepted by intelligence personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's heroic actions during the firefight, rescuing wounded soldiers, coordinating defensive positions, and maintaining unit cohesion under fire, were genuine acts of courage that went above and beyond what was expected, even in the context of the intelligence operation. Morrison felt a complex mixture of vindication and betrayal. While it was gratifying to have his heroism confirmed, he was deeply troubled by the fact that he had been manipulated without his knowledge. His entire understanding of that day in Afghanistan had been based on incomplete information. Chen continued his testimony by presenting additional evidence of Bradford's treachery. The Major had not only provided operational intelligence to enemy forces, but had also attempted to recruit other soldiers to participate in his activities. Several enlisted personnel had been approached by Bradford with offers of money in exchange for information, though none had agreed to cooperate. Major Bradford's activities resulted in the deaths of at least 12 coalition personnel and the wounding of more than 30 others, Chen testified. His betrayal compromised multiple operations and put countless soldiers at risk over a period of more than a year. Morrison thought about the memorial services he had attended for soldiers killed in those ambushes, the letters he had written to families explaining how their loved ones had died in service to their country. To learn that those deaths had been caused by a traitor within their own ranks was almost unbearable. Judge Hayes called for Captain Williams to respond to Chen's testimony. The prosecutor, who had seemed so confident just hours earlier, now appeared shaken and uncertain. The entire foundation of her case against Morrison had been based on testimony from a man who was now revealed to be a traitor. Your Honor, Williams began hesitantly. While Mr. Chen's testimony is certainly dramatic, I question whether it should be allowed to completely invalidate the testimony of other witnesses who served under Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. Chen immediately responded. Captain Williams, our investigation revealed that Major Bradford had systematically influenced the testimony of other soldiers by providing them with false information about Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's actions. Bradford spent months after the firefight convincing other members of the unit that Morrison had acted cowardly, gradually building a false narrative that he then used to support his accusations. Morrison remembered the weeks following the firefight, when Bradford had conducted what he called after-action discussions with various members of the unit. At the time, Morrison had thought Bradford was helping soldiers process their combat experience, but now he realized that Bradford had been manipulating their memories and perceptions. Staff Sergeant Torres and Corporal Rodriguez, who testified against Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, were both specifically targeted by Bradford's manipulation campaign, Chen continued. Bradford provided them with selective information and encouraged them to reinterpret their memories of the firefight in ways that supported his false narrative.